Pastor. I'd like to point out that, first of all, the class tonight is divided up into two major sections. One is on public prayer or liturgy. That is the question of what is the Mass to us and what do we get out of it, or what do we put into it, and what do we make of it. And then the other whole area is private prayer. It is our own spiritual life, our own attempt to commune with God, and how we go about that, what it means to us, especially, I suppose, how we would try to improve that. So that's the way this particular class is divided up. And the context into which it fits is the continual progression of understanding how we would get at the core of Christianity. It's one of the things I notice in the notes that I try to do at the end of each class is to try to get it down to one couple of sentences that would simply say what it is really all about and what we're trying to do. And that's one of the problems with studying theology, is that it seems to get so complicated and it's all over the place, and there's so many different ideas and so on, and there's schools of thought and there's opinions, and eventually, after you get through all that, you need to sort of boil it down in some way, or to have a simple way of saying what it's all about. That's one of our great lacks today of anybody, even people who study theology. I know I used to teach up at this seminary in Michigan, at Plymouth, Michigan. And they used to have me come there and teach, mostly just to try to pull together for these guys who are going to be the priests before long some coherent sense of what theology was like, because they've been studying it for many years, but they have trouble seeing it as a whole. And that's generally the problem. Many priests and ministers who don't seem to be able to get a hold of that. The training and study isn't very good along that line. And so part of what I keep trying to do is to get the organic picture, to get some one way of understanding how it all flows. And of course, I am influenced in that by my mentor, Karl Rahner, who was very good at that, and who was able to see it whole, to see it integrated. And that's what I keep trying to come back to with you, is to try to say it in a way that grows out of some beginning point, some place that we all can rest in and know ourselves. And that's why I go back to that notion of us as lovers, because I think that's a prime experience in life. And that's something that is sort of not disputed. I mean, we are the people who have the ability to love and who seek love. And so, and that puts us in relationship right away. So we are interpersonal creatures. Then we need to begin to make sense out of that interpersonal relationship. When we begin to look at that personal relationship, what about it? Well, it begins to have depths that it's hard to get a hold of. My logic doesn't serve me totally. There's something about loving relationships that exceed logic. And so I say, okay, I'm into a religious situation here. And then that raises the question to me of, will my desire for love ever be totally satisfied? And that raises the question of God. Is there an absolute love? Is there a power of love? Is there a totally encompassing, fulfilling love available? And of course the theist says, yes, there is. That our drive for love has meaning. It won't be frustrated forever. And then we say, well, where are we going to find that love, or what epitomizes? And we say, well, we see that in Jesus of Nazareth. There we say, there's the best lover who ever existed. There was the one who best broke out of selfishness and best was in touch with the power of love. And then we say, well, we have to remember that, or we have to get hold of it, or stay in touch with it, or get focused on it. And that's what the church does. The church should be a community of love, a sacrament of love, a place where love is real and manifest, palpable. It often isn't that, but that's the local congregation where we gather for worship. That's where it's supposed to happen. And we ought to at least, while it isn't perfect there, we ought to at least get glimmers that love is important, little clues that it's possible to live in a loving way. So that's to bring us up to date again and say, well, you could analyze the whole of what Christianity is about. You'd summarize it and say, God is love. That's how John summarized it. God is love. That's one way of saying that. We are lovers. It's another way of saying it. Christ is the fulfillment of love. Another way. The church is the community of love. So you could analyze it along that way. And you could analyze a lot of other ways. I'm never saying these are the only ways. It's not the only way to teach this course or to get a full view of theology, but it's one way. And it's good to have one way in your mind, to know what it is, because then you can critique other ways and bounce off of other ways and evaluate other ways. And you also have a way of saying, if someone ever did ask you, what does it mean to be a Christian, you could have some way of saying that. I trust the power of love. Something like that. Well, that brings us then to this class on prayer and the sacraments. As I said, it's divided into two parts: official worship, public prayer, and then also we will deal with private prayer, our own personal prayer. So I guess the way into this, I believe, is to bounce off of the worship experience. That is, to look at our own experience of celebrating Eucharist, going to the Lord's Supper, whatever, and see what that means to us, what we try to get out of it, at its best, what it does for us, what we contribute to it, and so on. So I'd like to have a little general discussion along that line. I'd like to hear your ideas. I mean, it's something that most people in the room, at least, have done a lot of, going to Mass, or celebrating worship, and what does that mean, and what do you get out of it, and so we see where that takes us.
I think for me, all the sacraments, I see more as a symbolic. And I noticed that you said in there it was, they're symbolic act, but I see them as totally symbolic, and that, maybe you said this too, but that God's grace is always there, and those are just things that help us reach that. But it's not like if you receive the Eucharist, you're graced, or if you get baptized, you're more graced, or anything like that. And I just wonder how much trouble that gets me in with, what Catholics collectively believe.
Okay, that's a very important point. I think I'll bracket it and come back to it. Let's hear more. But it's really crucial. I mean, what you mean by symbol and how it relates to God's grace in the world. Absolutely crucial. So we don't want to lose it, but we'll see what other ideas we get.
I think a lot of times, just speaking in general about masses, I think I get a lot more out of them when I can myself participate a lot more. I know if they sing songs I know, or things, the ways that I can participate, it's easier, for me, what I can get back rather than what I'm getting out of it, what I'm putting into it.
So those go together somehow. And Maria, what becomes a difference? I mean, what's the feeling like when you don't know the songs or don't participate?
You feel like you're just there watching. You're not actually a part of it. You're kind of on the outside.
A spectator. And maybe not even a too active a spectator. I saw some heads nodding. Anybody want to pick up on Maria's point?
I wanted to say that I do feel differently when I'm at the Eucharistic ministry after Mass than when I'm not. I feel I'm participating a lot more. And that way I think I get a lot more. It just fills me out when I get ministry.
So you like that when you have the chance to distribute communion?
Yeah.
And the interesting phrase you talked about, two words being filled up and getting energy. There's two things that you would see happening when you are participating. I don't want to lose Maria's point, but those I find interesting too. I wonder how many people can gravitate to those words or find those words as saying something that happens at Mass. Filled up, energy, collected, connected with the Lord. Well, we'll leave that float around.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean,
Yeah.
it just seems to be a general thing. Sometimes I'm filled up with energy and or filled up and energized, and other times I leave Mass and it's like nothing went on.
Okay.
Is
Very
what I would
distinct
say.
experiences.
Yeah, I can tell one from the other.
Yeah.
And in one, the
Got
same.
any sense what causes one or the other?
I think part of it is what mood I go into it. Another part of it is how the celebrant or celebrants, how they're acting. If they just are going through the motions real quick, and if they, their homily is just something I've heard over and over again, or if it's something new and tries to apply to real life, and when they raise the host, it's really something. It's not by Christ's blood, something like that. There's a fine difference there. You can tell when they're into it too.
Yes. Interesting. Two things again. You said one was what you brought to it, the mood you were in, and so on, and then the other side of it, the quality, I would say, of the celebration.
The celebrant and the celebrant. Yeah, if you have
Right.
a screaming kid behind me, I can't.
Yeah.
I always lose contact.
Yeah. So, and in the quality, the role of the celebrant is important, but so are certain other factors. Yeah. What else?
I can identify very strongly with what Maria said about the participation because I'm not Catholic, and I've noticed I started coming approximately last September, and so I can't participate in communion, and that a lot of times that bothers me a lot. But I've noticed that the longer I've been coming, and I've learned the songs, or I've learned what to say, that those nights when you do have more songs I know, or things are going right, I just leave with a much better feeling. And things look more to me.
Yeah,
to
that's
be a
really a
part of it.
distinctive slant you have on it there, as in terms of like not being able to go to communion and so on. Did you worship regularly at another church before that? Do you want to say something about that? And
It's quite a different type of church. It was a Christian Missionary Alliance, it's called. And it's much different because it is not as ritualized.
Yeah.
It's when most every time that there's prayer, it's just coming off the top of the guy's head.
Yes,
It's not, there's not so much that everybody says, response.
right. It's a very interesting contrast, isn't it?
Yes.
You could probably sense one of the great dangers of the Catholic approach to this, which is of formalism.
I will notice
Yeah.
sometimes somebody will be sitting next to me behind me, especially, and I notice it most in community because that's something I want to participate in.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're not into it and they're talking or
Yeah.
whatever about classes, and I just want to shake them and say,
Yeah.
"Don't you realize what you've got? I want that and I can't have it, and you're not
Yeah.
even paying attention."
Yeah.
And that can cause a lot of pain sometimes.
Yes, I'm sure. Now, would it be true to say that in the other church, that wasn't as much of a problem, that formalism or people not being into it, or am I wrong in that?
I think people still kind of got into that. It wasn't exactly the same as because it's a different slant, but they got into use the right buzzwords and make sure you carry your Bible in and things like this. And people still fell into the same type
Oh,
of
really?
trap.
The same
So,
trap existed there.
I think so.
A
To a certain
different way.
degree. Yeah. They just, I better show up. Who's watching? Did the Smiths come this week? Or
I really did. There's no doubt that within Catholicism, you have a problem that way. Any very formalized religion you do. But it's good to remember what you just said, that all religions would have the problem to some degree. It would just look a little different, I suppose, in some settings. So you'd have the same thing. Do you use the right words, and you carry your Bible in or not? And that's interesting. And also the slant of saying, you've got something here that I would like to do, and you should see it, more positively. I really think that one of the things that in the sacramental life, this whole renewal of the RCIA has a power that way. Now, I don't know how much it comes across always, but I mean, I do know Catholics who have been very impressed with other adult Catholics becoming Catholic through the RCIA program. That it means a lot to them. It's very emotional, because I think, at least the way it's been explained to me, is because it's like challenges one's own commitment. Like you're saying, well, here's an adult person making this move, and they're serious enough to go through all this stuff, and what am I doing? I think it's something like that. There's something inspiring about it. The RCIA is big around the country, and it makes an impact, and I don't know if we've exactly figured out how to do it all right yet, but there's something good about it to see adults in the process of making this decision.
I'm probably going to go through that. I'm being married in September, and afterwards then my future husband almost seems more excited about it sometimes than I am, because he'll go through it with me.
Yeah.
And he is Catholic. I was like, that'd be really neat,
Yeah.
to get that.
That's true, I think, yeah.
Rejuvenation or whatever.
I think very often the Catholics who go through the program carefully as a sponsor or a spouse or something do end up getting a lot out of it. What else? How we just talking about, Tim, eliciting comments in general about Sunday worship, weekend worship, Lord's Supper, Mass, what we get out of it, or really it's wide open, and what the problems are with it, or what it means to us, and so on.
Seems like one thing to me is a common ritual like the Eucharist seems to maybe wonder in one thing to me, and a few years from now it's going to mean a little more.
Yeah.
Seems like
I think that's how symbols are in a way. It allows for gradually deeper participation in them. Anything else that wants to throw in here?
I was just going to say that and give a kind of a history. I guess when I was much younger, it was more of a, it's because of my parents I did go to church, and I don't think, if not for them, I would have gone. Because there were times when I was away from home, which I probably wouldn't have gone to church. But then I think eventually I developed my own commitment for coming to church, and I got involved in playing the guitar. And I felt that I was part of the community, and it gave me a reason to be there more than just coming there and leaving. I felt I was giving more input to Sunday Mass besides just being there on Sunday. And that makes it much more.
And again,
rewarding.
it's the participation that seems important to you. Okay, anybody else? Worship. Group worship.
I think it provides just a point where everything can be laid down just for a while, and then everyone can be like as one, just for a short time, and the world can be put away for a little bit. For all the worries can be put down for a while, and you can concentrate on this one unifying thing.
Your phrase that sort of lay things down, the ordinary time stops in a sense, and
You'd step like into another world for a little while,
Yeah.
and become the distractions of the world and things that seem to be always there can be put away for a little bit, and you can kind of recenter.
Refocus, recenter, yeah. That's been a very traditional notion of liturgy that Tim just brought up among religions. Liturgy has always been a way to sort of move into another time, to move in where ordinary time isn't operative. In that sense, liturgy is a lot like play, because that happens in play too. Because ordinary time, like if you're watching the last part of a pro football game, and there's 2 minutes to go, you know it's not going to last 2 minutes on the clock. You know, you're in another time. Ordinary time, the watch doesn't matter now. It's like when we really get involved in play, we are lifted out of ordinary time. It's sort of inconsequential what the watch is saying. And that's been a traditional notion of liturgy among primitive people. They saw it as moving back into the time of the gods. In illo tempore, in those days, you were sort of reenacting what the gods did at the beginning of time. And that's why the holy men used to be the leaders of the worship and were like the conduits to that world. They were the ones who knew the secrets of getting you back into that world. It was a very interesting idea. In other words, the primitives had the idea that history was running downhill and things were sort of getting worse and worse and heavier, and life's going down. And then liturgy was your way of getting back in. They even had things like sacred prostitution as a part of worship, because it was a way of redoing the intercourse of the gods at the beginning of the time that created the fertility. So by reenacting the sexual acts of the gods at the beginning, you could get back into touch with their power. And that's what helped the fertility of the crops and so on. It's very interesting to link ritual with, throughout the whole history of religion. There's much of it that's very instructive, and what I'm picking up there is the time element. Including in modern times, I always talk about it as being stop action, in a sense. It's like today we wouldn't think of it, I hope not at least, as going back into those other times, but we think of it as sanctifying the time now. In other words, what you're really sanctifying is who you are now. Our sense is that God would meet us now, and so that through a week's time, all this stuff goes on. There's hurts and wounds, and there's joys, and you don't get a chance to celebrate enough, and you don't get a chance to heal enough. It's all going on, fast and furious and so on. And liturgy is like a time to stop the action and to gain the healing and the strength, and to say thank you for the good things, and to worship God for the blessings of things went right. Or to pick up on your thing, is another phrase I often use, is that liturgy is our way of warding off chaos. That's a lot what Betty said too, is the ritualized activity, the form. That's one of the things that formalism, while it's a Catholic problem, it's not all bad either, because to have formal things, set ways, helps you to get rooted again. That's why when people die, to have liturgy is really helpful, because that's the perfect word. It wards off chaos. I mean, your world falls apart when a loved one dies. Everything's wrong. The bottom falls out. And the liturgy, at that time, you feel one of its powers, that I think it's got all the time, is then to help order. And that's why the very familiarity of the ritual, often when people are really hurting suffering. I mean, they might not want to have liturgical dance that week or weird things going on. You know? They want to have that set thing.
No clowns.
Yes, right. They want to have a set thing that will root. Does anybody else ever feel that, or do you know what I'm talking about, or you want to comment on it?
Well, it's nice to know that wherever you go in a Catholic church, it will be a mass that you're familiar with.
Yeah.
When you go, like I've been, into Mexico, and I've been into Canada, and been to Spanish-speaking masses and French-speaking
Yeah.
masses, and not being able to understand what
Really.
you're saying, and you still know
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah, and it'll have differences, little differences,
Yeah.
but there will be a fundamental
Yeah.
structure in a sense. And ritual is like that. I mean, we know that rituals mean a lot to people for that very reason.
Well, and you take comfort in that.
Yeah.
It's a universal.
That's a good word, yeah. You take comfort in it. You know.
Gives a sense of security.
Yeah. And again, it links up with other rituals we use in daily life, like a Thanksgiving meal. I mean, it seems sort of important that you do it somewhat the same in your family, you know. I mean, you might have certain varieties, but what seems to stick is that there is a certain ritual about it. That it's something that you do regularly. And then that's like reaffirming what the family's all about. And where we are in things, where we fit, finding that comfort and solace and so on. Yeah, anybody else on what the Mass does?
I was just wondering how that type of idea would relate to today's society changing so rapidly. So few things that you have as a root, and maybe the youth today, where they turn to with that ideology. More people should be turning to the Catholic Church. And the question then would be, if the Catholic and Roman is going down with youth, why is it happening? Is it because we're not communicating what the church is about in these types of terms?
Well, it's a very good question. Especially you can attack it sort of sociologically. The way that it's often posed is in terms of, well, did the changes in the liturgy end up hurting us this way? In other words, we made major changes in the 60s on the liturgy. People in this room don't remember the old masses, do you?
Yeah. I remember Latin.
A little bit
Do
of
you?
yeah, parts of it.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh. Like when you were in grade school?
Very
I've heard about
young.
them.
First, second grade, right around there.
Must be great in there.
Who else was there? Some of you were not at Latin Mass.
No, I've heard
Remember
about
Latin
them.
Mass?
No, I've heard about
They're
them.
probably born after it stopped.
Somewhere, but it's not a big dividing line here. It must have been right sort of before 20 years. We changed that in right after the council. I'm guessing. Or did we change it even during that? Because I was in Sandusky. I remember the very first Mass we did that. So it was in the middle 60s when we moved away.
I mean, when you shifted from Latin to
Latin,
English?
yeah, and there was a whole when we started facing the people.
Oh my!
Facing the
Did you want to do that
I remember
before
when
they
that
actually
happened,
did that? You see what I'm saying? You know
Yeah,
what
I
mean?
do see what you're saying, and it bears on this point too. There's something you have to understand about that world. A world creates a whole way of being, and it's hard to ask questions within a given worldview. We don't recognize it because we're in a world, and there's all kind of questions we don't ask but you didn't ask that kind of question. I mean, it wasn't an option. It wasn't
Well, someone did, because it eventually changed.
Eventually, but you see, the reason it changed is because of historical studies. Because they went back and found out in the early centuries that Mass was said facing the people.
Oh.
most of the liturgical changes in the 20th century, in 1960s, came about as a result of historical studies that were started in the early 1900s. And it was a very important book published in, I'm not remembering exactly when, but I'd guess around 1920, by Joseph Jungmann, which was the history of the Mass. And you see, when you lived in that world, you assumed that it was always done this way, the way we did it, in Latin, back to the people. You even used to read the Epistle and Gospel in Latin. And
people understand it?
No, but they had missals. They used to have missals with the English in it, and you'd follow. And of course, when we learned, like, to serve Mass, you learned Latin. You had to learn all the prayers to answer in Latin. But it's instructive what you're saying here about, and I'll get back to your point because I think it's a very crucial point, and the answer is not easy. But when you're in that world, you just simply accept it. It's the way it is. I mean, there's a lot of strange things that went on in the Catholic world, but you didn't have people sitting around a group like this saying, "That's weird, man, let's change that." I mean, it didn't happen. And the only way you can understand that is if you changed culture sometime or had some big shift in your life.
You try to imagine going back to that way now. You can't imagine.
Yeah, no, you can't imagine it that way, but we all live in a world now, too, the same way, but we just can't imagine what the questions are. Like 30 years from now, we'll look back and say, well, no one sat around the room and said blah, blah, blah. I mean, we don't know what that is, because a culture conditions you to ask only certain questions. A language conditions you, and so you don't know what they are. That's why you have prophets and revolutionary changes and so on. So the answer to your question was, I mean, I can't remember, like, when I celebrated Mass, ever thinking differently. But, I should be facing people instead of my back to people. It never dawned on me. But I can tell you, there was a very crucial time for me. I was ordained in 1962, and I celebrated many Masses like that. And I went, the bishop sent me out to Boulder, Colorado for an institute or something. And it was a study school for campus ministers, probably in the middle 60s. And out there, for the first time, I was involved in Masses that would be like we call home Masses these days. It would just be a group around and very informal. And after all the Masses I had said of them, it was the first time I ever understood the Mass or the power of the Mass. Out of that experience, that's very clear to me. I remember that so well. And I had been a priest for a number of years and said hundreds or how many Masses up till then, and never felt what I thought, came to see was the communal power of the Eucharist. And it was because we were in a different setting, and it was sort of experimental, and it was small group, and the people who were running it knew what they were doing, etc. In studying liturgy in before 1960 in the seminary, we had no perception of what the liturgy was. Like this class tonight, all the stuff I have in those notes there, I would have known none of that when I was ordained after studying theology for 6 years. None of that. I would have no perception of it. Now that's hard to believe that today, and that's not all that many years ago. So what you had is a world, a Catholic world, that was very set. And the Mass was done exactly the same way every place. I remember when I was first ordained, and I had a wedding at another parish, and I went in and did the Mass, and I felt pretty good about it. I thought the homily went well, and I was very pleased with it. And I got out, and the Monsignor, the pastor, he was really upset. And I thought, boy, I'd done a really neat job. And instead, he's very mad. And he said, well, don't you know you hold your hands like this, not like this? That was all prescribed, where your hands were held as you would say the prayers. It was something like this, not like this. I mean, he thought I was crazy. You had your hands out like this. What kind of a nut are you? So that the Mass was, I mean, it was so fixed, and the personality of the priest had no play in it. The remark you made would have had no sense. You had a group of Catholics sitting in 1960, and you'd have sat there and you'd have said that, and they'd say, "What? What are you talking about?" They would have no sense of that. So there is a major sea change that occurred in the 60s, and we are the heirs of that. Now, back to the question then is, you see, ritual does have a traditional sense, and ritual needs to be somehow the same to work. Now, the Catholic ritual probably seems sort of different than your free church thing, although, as you pointed out, it's got its bits and pieces of it, but not to the extent. So that the Catholic ritual had a power, and everyone was into it, and you didn't question it. And it just happened. It was always there, and you could count on it. Now, we made the changes, and there's no doubt that Mass attendance fell off. In the Catholic circles, it fell from about 75% regular attendance before 1968, and it fell down to where Catholics were going at about a 50% rate, which brought us down almost to the level of the average Protestant community in terms of their regularity of rate. Now that's sort of a major kind of change, and so the theorists, sociologists, and so on would have to ask why, and they would have to ask themselves, is it because we changed it, and therefore it lost its power, and then didn't grab up the young people, so on. Now, Andrew Greeley has done a lot of study of this, and he thinks that this isn't true. His data shows that whenever we made the changes, I think was like 64, something like that, when we made that change, to 68, Mass attendance stayed steady. Something big happened in 68 and changed it. It dropped 20-some points, and then it's leveled now in the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, it's starting to creep up again, the Catholic percentage. And the thing that happened in 1968 pertains to our next class, and that is Humane Vitae, the birth control encyclical. So Andy Greeley's research tells him that what caused the drop was the birth control position, which had a lot of ramifications. That it called the Catholic authority into question. A lot of people saw moral problems in a new way and so on. But maybe I'll save that for next week. So based on that kind of study, my own sense is that the changes in the Mass were accepted and are accepted, and that greater flexibility is actually a plus and not a negative. And the fact that it would be a little different when done in Spain or Canada or someplace, and that it would be a little different here at the university than at Jesu Parish and so on, that isn't a problem for the Catholic people. And it's still enough structured, it's still enough settled things there that you can grab onto it. There's no doubt that Catholicism is a religion of ritual, and that's our strength in a way and also our weakness. I always use this example to play it off against, well, I guess I'm jumping ahead into things specifically Kathy, the last class. I better save some of that and stay with ritual here. But Catholicism is a heavily ritualized religion, there's no doubt about it.
Is there any thought along the lines of maybe the Catholic Church forecasting the birth control coming up and getting prepared for society's response to that and how it's going to affect the masses attending the churches?
No. What happened in the birth control encyclical is that, which was issued in 1968, is that Pope John the 23rd was a very open-minded fellow who really called the Second Vatican Council. And so when I talk about us, I don't want to lose people. Historically, it's hard for us to remember that the council is a historical event for you people. I mean, the council was so crucial to us. I mean, it was such a big thing, and that was 62 to 65 when that occurred. John the 23rd called that council, and he set up a commission to study the birth control thing. But they were to study it not so much in terms of, well, what damage will be done depending on what position we take, but just what's the right position. And the committee voted something like 60 to 4 to liberalize the church's position, and Pope Paul VI followed the 4 and not the 60. And that's what really created the problem. You see, in the popular mind, the whole thing was created. People knew this, and that it was going on, and everyone expected a change. And then when it didn't come, it dashed to people's hopes that the church was really going to address sexuality in a real way and deal with it in a way that made sense. And that's what hurt. But anyway, I don't want to preempt, because we will talk about morality next class and get into the specifics of that maybe. But here was the question of how ritual functions, Jim. We could, lest I forget how later on. With all kinds of opportunities and a long period of time before one's going to get married or establish some sort of family. And that just exacerbates the problem. Obviously, as a culture, we haven't done a great job of figuring out how to manage that too well. I want to just pick up a couple of things here. We can go to any one of these particular topics at this time. But the idea of pleasure, having negative notions of pleasure, needs to be reversed because even in the tradition, it's been there. Thomas Aquinas said that pleasure was one of the important factors in moral development, that pleasure should accompany good actions, that it should be pleasurable to live. That's part of the virtue idea again, that pleasure is something that ought to work for us, not against us. And that I really think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, we get out of whack. It probably when pleasure seeking is out of whack, it's probably because something else is wrong, because we're fixated at some lower level of development, or are dealing with some sort of compulsiveness, or something like that. So we need to get a much more positive notion of pleasure into morality, and I think that's proper and needs to be done. The other thing is a realization ourselves of where laws come from. 10 Commandments are a good example of that. We've got an image of God writing them on stone and handing them on and so on, really being from on high. But when you look at the 10 Commandments, Adam, similar commandments in other cultures and so on, what they are and are really what all the laws end up being are codified statements of the wisdom of the community. It's what people have generally learned and figured out and then have gotten written down in a summary statement. They really don't come from on high. They come out of the wisdom of the community. That's one of the things I always like to talk about, is more the wisdom of the community. So thou shalt not steal is a commandment, but it's not like God wrote it on a piece of stone and then, well, we don't get this, but okay, we won't steal. It's like groups of people in interacting found out that life goes a lot better if we all agree we don't steal, because then I don't have to watch my possessions all the time. And their life goes better for all of us. And so we say, well, this is good. It goes better if we don't kill one another. It goes better if we don't commit adultery and don't defame each other's names. So the 10 Commandments grow out of the community. And that's what the way I think of most of that is, that you can't have an authoritative group like the church saying, you're immoral because you did this. No priest, no bishop, no clergyman, rabbi, anybody can ever do that. But a leader in a community can know the wisdom and say, well, if we put it more precisely, we probably say, well, in the long history of our community, we have figured out that life goes better if premarital sex is avoided. We've seen that there's these bad consequences, and we've seen other things that have gone wrong, and our collected wisdom says that it's better not to do that. So then you could get a biblical statement against fornication. You know, that would be a codification of what the group has ended up thinking about this question. So if we're going to overturn this negative thing that Calvin and Julius were talking about, it's going to be because we see law, moral law, in a new way. That's why I like a different language, to sort of divert us from the idea it's from on high, or your parents tell you, or the clergy tells you, or some authority figure.
Is the Catholic Church, I know we have a really conservative pope in there now, but are they making, the Catholic Church I realize is the whole, but as far as the hierarchy, the political hierarchy, popes and the cardinals and bishops, are they making any move towards going down to the roots and coming back up? It seems like they're just pushing more of the laws and doctrine.
I would say not. We've got a real reactionary trend there. The article I just gave you, brings that out in many ways. But a good example of this is on the question of birth control in the Catholic community. There was a group of 68 people that were brought together by Pope Paul VI in what looked like a very forward-looking move to discuss the birth control question back in the late 60s. And that sounded like doing what you were saying, get to the base, find out there were married couples, the Crowleys from Chicago were on it, and everything. So they studied it for a long period of time. They discussed it, came up with it. They came down to vote, and they voted 64-4 to liberalize the Catholic stand on birth control, to say that contraception would be fitting and proper in certain circumstances. They voted 64-4, and Paul VI sided with the 4 and wrote the famous encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968. So I would say, in general, we haven't done well that way. But I don't know, where else what other good examples we would find. Now, we could take the Catholic bishops, the way they are approaching many of these questions. Take the peace and war question. They did all kind of consulting. They had hearings. They listened to all kinds of people. They put out drafts. They discussed them. They're doing the same thing with the economics pastoral now. Doing the same thing with the campus ministry pastoral. So there we see, it seems to me, quite an enlightened approach. And the whole idea of issuing drafts is very good, because what it does is when people read the first draft, they say, well, geez, I don't like this. I'll get my say in here. And then, so you get a real process going. So in one sense, our American bishops, representing the hierarchy, are doing an excellent job on this whole question. Now in Rome, I'd say they're doing less well on many things of doing what you want to say. But see, that the peace pass was a good example of that.
It just seems such a split, because on Nightline they had, I think, John McGuire.
Dan McGuire.
Or Dan McGuire. And then a woman from some...
Yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, and it was just unbelievable. This is the Catholic Church, I'm a member of this, and it's so schizophrenic. Can I say it? And I mentioned it several other times before.